Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something I think a lot of you wanted to learn more about the perfume industry.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and specifically a recent BBC investigation
Okay.
into child labor and jasmine harvesting in Egypt.
Oh.
So it turns out that bottle of perfume on your vanity might have a pretty complicated
Yeah.
and ethically murky backstory.
It's true. The things that we often associate with luxury and beauty, like perfume, can have surprisingly intricate supply chains.
Right.
And unfortunately, those supply chains sometimes hide some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, let's face it, we don't usually think about where those delicate floral scents come from, do we?
Right.
The BBC report zeroed in on Egypt,
Yeah, okay.
which is a major global supplier of jasmine for perfume.
Interesting.
So we're talking vast fields of these tiny white flowers, all handpicked in the middle of the night.
Wow.
Imagine the dedication that takes.
It certainly does, but that dedication often comes at a steep price.
Yeah.
The work itself is incredibly demanding, and the pay is shockingly low. In fact, the BBC spoke with families who rely on their children, some as young as 5 years old,
Whoa.
to help them pick enough flowers to survive.
Gosh.
It really raises the question of whether that beautiful scent comes with a hidden cost of exploitation.
Okay, so we're not just talking about some generic fragrance oil here.
No.
This Egyptian jasmine ends up in perfumes from big-name brands like Lancôme and Aerin Beauty.
Wow. Okay.
They tout ethical sourcing.
Right.
But the BBC went undercover
Oh.
and found a starkly different reality.
That's right. The investigation uncovered children working on farms that directly supply the factories producing jasmine oil.
Oh, wow.
And to understand the scale of this, we need to talk about fragrance houses.
Fragrance houses.
Yeah, these are specialized companies that create the perfume blends for the big brands.
Okay.
So you essentially have a whole pyramid structure at the top. You have the luxury brands, then the fragrance houses, then the factories, and at the very bottom, the often invisible workers picking the jasmine.
Wait, so there's this whole chain of companies between those picking the flowers and me buying a bottle of perfume.
Exactly.
I had no idea.
And each step in that chain adds pressure to keep costs down.
Right.
The big brands at the top, the perfume masters, as they're sometimes called, set tight budgets.
Okay.
That pressure trickles down all the way to the bottom, meaning incredibly low wages for the jasmine pickers, often forcing them to rely on child labor just to make ends meet.
It's almost like a hidden system.
Yeah, it is.
And get this, the BBC even got hold of audit reports from these companies.
Really?
And guess what? They don't tell the whole story.
Oh, no.
They tend to focus on the factories, but completely overlook the small farms where most of the jasmine is actually picked.
That's a classic example of what's often referred to as audit washing.
Audit washing.
Yeah, think of it like it's like checking the cleanliness of a restaurant kitchen,
Okay.
but ignoring the rat infestation in the food storage area.
Yeah.
You're creating the appearance of ethical practices without actually addressing the root of the problem.
Right.
And this BBC investigation really gives us a glimpse behind the curtain of those glossy perfume ads.
So how many kids are we talking about here?
It's tough to get an exact number, but the BBC's reporting indicates it's significant.
Okay.
They visited several locations during the harvest season and saw children working on these small farms that supply the main factories.
Wow.
And remember, all of this is happening in the dead of night to protect the delicate jasmine flowers.
Working through the night at such a young age, it's pretty unsettling.
It is.
And we're not just talking about long hours and low pay.
Right.
The BBC followed one family, a mother named Heba and her 4 children,
Oh, wow.
who all work picking jasmine.
Goodness.
Her 10-year-old daughter, Basmala, has developed a severe eye allergy from the jasmine.
Yes. And the doctor she saw warned that if Basmala continues working in the fields, her vision could be permanently affected.
Wow.
It just highlights the very real human cost behind those fragrant bottles.
Okay, so we've established that the working conditions are pretty grim.
Yeah.
But who holds the power in this situation?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the fragrance houses or the big perfume brands themselves?
The BBC spoke with an independent perfumer, Christophe Laudamiel, who actually worked inside one of these fragrance houses for years.
Oh, wow.
He confirmed that the big perfume brands, the masters, are the ones calling the shots.
Okay.
They determine the budget for the fragrance houses,
Right.
which creates immense pressure on each stage of the supply chain.
So are we basically saying that these big brands are knowingly profiting from child labor?
Well, it's a complicated situation.
Okay.
And it's important to remember that these companies have signed agreements with the UN promising to eliminate child labor from their supply chains.
Right.
But as this investigation reveals,
Yep.
those promises aren't always translating into tangible action on the ground.
So there's a disconnect between what they're saying and what's actually happening.
It seems so.
Yep.
And it gets even more interesting. The BBC obtained copies of audit reports from two organizations frequently cited by these companies as proof of their ethical practices,
Oh, yeah?
SEDEX and UEBT.
Right.
What's shocking is that these reports either completely glossed over the issue of child labor
Really?
or focused solely on the factories, entirely ignoring the small farms where, as we've seen, most of the exploitation takes place.
So these audits, are they just for show? Or are they designed to protect the company's reputations rather than the workers?
That's a difficult question to answer definitively, but the BBC's investigation raises some serious concerns about the effectiveness of these audits and whether they're actually achieving their intended purpose.
Right.
They spoke with Sarah Dadish,
Oh, yeah?
a lawyer specializing in human rights in global supply chains.
Okay.
She was pretty blunt,
Ah.
stating that these systems are clearly failing.
So where does this leave us?
Yeah.
Are we supposed to just boycott perfume altogether?
Yeah.
It's not like we as individuals can single-handedly fix this issue?
That's a really good question, and one that many consumers are grappling with.
Yeah.
The BBC actually asked Hiba,
Yeah.
the jasmine picker we talked about earlier,
Right.
what she thought people who buy these perfumes should do.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
Yeah.
I'm really curious to hear what she had to say.
Yeah, me too.
What was her response?
She said that she doesn't mind people using perfume.
Okay.
She simply wants them to understand the pain and suffering that often goes into producing it.
Yeah.
She wants people to see the faces of the children behind those luxurious scents
Right.
and speak up about the injustice they face.
Her message is incredibly poignant
It is.
and really hits home, but is consumer pressure truly enough to bring about meaningful change?
That's where things get a bit more complex.
Okay.
Some experts, like Sarah Dadish, the lawyer we mentioned earlier, argue that placing the entire burden of change on consumers isn't fair and may not be effective in the long run.
That makes sense. It's unrealistic to expect consumers to inspect every factory and farm in a company's supply chain. Yeah. Dadush believes that stricter laws and regulations are necessary to hold corporations accountable for ethical practices throughout their entire supply chains.
Okay.
It's a systemic issue, and as such, requires systemic solutions.
So it sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Consumers need to be more aware and demand transparency from the brands they support.
Right.
But we also need stronger laws and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that companies are held responsible for their actions.
I agree.
It feels like a daunting task, though.
It is.
What can we as individuals do to make a difference?
All right, so we've uncovered some pretty unsettling practices within the perfume industry.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, what do the companies involved have to say about all of this? Did the BBC reach out to them for a response?
They did. The BBC presented their findings to both the fragrance houses and the big perfume brands to get their side of the story.
Okay.
Okay, let's start with the fragrance houses.
Right.
What did Givaudan, the one that makes Lancôme and Aerin, have to say? Givaudan called the investigation deeply alarming and stated their commitment to working with the industry to eliminate child labor.
That's kind of a vague response, though.
Yeah.
Did they offer any specific actions they're taking?
Not really. Nefreminic, the fragrance house behind Ikat Jasmine and Le Monde de Sicilia for Aerin Beauty, said they've switched to a new supplier in Egypt.
Okay.
They also emphasized their dedication to initiatives addressing child labor with industry partners and local farmers.
Okay, but what about those at the top, the big brands like Lancôme and Aerin Beauty? After all, they're the ones with the most power and influence.
Right, and the BBC did contact them as well.
Okay, good.
L'Oréal, Lancome's parent company, told the BBC they are actively committed to upholding human rights standards and claim to never pressure fragrance houses to lower costs at the expense of farmers.
That sounds a bit like a standard PR response.
Yeah, it does a little bit.
Did they acknowledge the specific issues the BBC uncovered?
They did admit that risks exist in certain parts of the world where their suppliers operate. They say they're working to identify the root causes of these problems and find ways to resolve them.
So they're aware of the problem, but are still figuring out solutions. It's a little frustrating, isn't it?
I understand your frustration.
Yeah.
It's natural to want to see concrete actions and immediate change when confronted with such serious issues.
Right.
But these things often take time,
Yeah.
and navigating complex global supply chains is no easy feat.
That's true. But did L'Oréal offer any specifics about how they plan to ensure fair wages and prevent child labor in their supply chain?
Yes. They did provide a further statement to the BBC stating they are striving to guarantee decent wages for farmers, access to education for their children, and the implementation of human rights laws and policies to prevent child labor.
Okay.
They also claim to have a detailed action plan in place with suppliers for the upcoming harvest season, with teams on the ground in Egypt to evaluate its effectiveness.
Okay, that sounds a little more promising.
Yeah.
But how can we be sure these promises translate into real change? What about Estée Lauder, Aerin Beauty's parent company?
Yes.
What was their response?
Estée Lauder echoed L'Oréal's sentiments, stating they believe in protecting the rights of all children and that they are investigating the matter with their suppliers.
Okay.
They acknowledged the complexities of the socioeconomic environment surrounding the jasmine supply chain,
Right.
and said they're taking steps to improve transparency and the livelihoods of the communities involved.
It all sounds a bit vague, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit.
A lot of talk about investigating and taking steps, but no real concrete details.
You're right. It can be frustrating to hear these general statements without specifics.
Yeah.
And that highlights one of the major challenges with these sprawling global supply chains.
Right.
It's often difficult to trace products back to their origin and hold companies accountable for every step of the process.
So where does this leave us? Are we supposed to just boycott perfume altogether?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And one that many consumers are grappling with.
I think so.
The BBC actually asked Hiba, a jasmine picker we talked about earlier, what she thought people who buy these perfumes should do.
Oh, wow. That's powerful. I'm really curious to hear what she had to say.
Yeah.
What was her response?
She said that she doesn't mind people using perfume.
Okay.
She simply wants them to understand the pain and suffering that often goes into producing it. You know?
Yeah.
She wants people to see the faces of the children behind those luxurious scents and speak up about the injustice they face.
Her message is so powerful, and it really hits home.
Yeah.
But is consumer pressure truly enough to bring about meaningful change?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complex.
Yeah.
Some experts, like Sarah Dadouche, the lawyer we mentioned earlier,
Right.
argue that placing the entire burden of change on consumers isn't fair.
Right.
And may not be effective in the long run.
That makes sense. It's unrealistic to expect consumers to inspect every factory and farm in a company's supply chain.
Precisely. Dadouche believes that stricter laws and regulations are necessary to hold corporations accountable for ethical practices throughout their entire supply chains.
Okay.
It's a systemic issue, and as such, requires systemic solutions.
So it sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Consumers need to be more aware and demand transparency from the brands they support.
Right.
But we also need stronger laws and enforcement mechanisms to ensure that companies are held responsible for their actions.
Absolutely.
It feels like a daunting task, though.
It can be, yeah.
What can we as individuals do to make a difference?
Well, a great first step is simply staying informed.
Okay.
Investigations like this one from the BBC are crucial for shedding light on these hidden issues.
Right.
So keep seeking out information, read articles, listen to podcasts, and engage in conversations about ethical consumerism.
So it's about educating ourselves and staying aware of what's happening behind the scenes.
So exactly.
But beyond that, are there any concrete actions we can take?
Absolutely. One of the most effective things you can do is contact the companies directly.
Right.
Send emails, make phone calls, or reach out on social media. Let them know that you're aware of the problems in their supply chain and that you expect them to take real steps to address them.
It seems like companies are paying more attention to public pressure these days,
Yeah.
especially on social media.
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe they're realizing that consumers really do care about these issues, and it can affect their bottom line.
Exactly. And speaking of the bottom line, don't underestimate the power of your wallet.
Right.
Support brands that are transparent about their supply chains and demonstrate a genuine commitment to ethical sourcing.
Okay.
There are organizations that rate and certify companies based on their social and environmental impact.
Oh, wow. Right.
Do your research and make informed choices.
So it's not just about avoiding certain brands. It's about actively supporting the ones doing things the right way.
Yes.
What about pushing for bigger changes beyond just individual consumer choices?
That's where advocating for systemic change comes in. Contact your elected officials and urge them to support legislation that promotes fair labor practices and holds corporations accountable for human rights abuses in their supply chains.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I never really considered where the ingredients in my perfume come from
Right.
or the conditions under which they were produced.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people might be in the same boat.
It's easy to get swept up in the allure of luxury and forget about the human cost behind beautiful products.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that our choices as consumers have real-world impacts.
Right.
We have the power to demand better from the companies we support and push for a more just and equitable global economy.
So the next time I see a tempting perfume ad, I'll definitely think twice about the journey those fragrant oils took to get to that bottle.
That's the spirit. Ask questions, do your research, and remember that true beauty should never come at the expense of human dignity.
Well said, and that wraps up our deep dive into the scent of exploitation. We hope this episode has inspired you to be a more conscious consumer and to think critically about the products you buy and their impact on the world around us. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.